I think we all know, I'm Sophie, and I've been doing research for the past 2 years on generative green hydrogen energy storage for remote Arctic communities. Um, and I focused on Arctic communities because there's quite a few across Canada's north, many more in Alaska, and they face the most extreme socioeconomic kind of and environmental impacts when they're trying to get away from diesel. And it was interesting to high latitude energy consulting where I was working before I started. And green hydrogen storage, for anyone who doesn't know, it's kind of comprised of these three components where we can make hydrogen with an electrolyzer, store it in a tank, and then take that hydrogen and convert it or make electricity with a fuel cell. And as we know, or maybe are familiar with, the key to getting to high renewable energy penetration levels in these communities is unlocking longer duration storage. So batteries are great, the cost has really come down, but they have some limitations. And green hydrogen storage is interesting. There's a lot of interest around it as a long duration storage mechanism that can provide energy for deficits of weeks to maybe even months. And that's because of its high energy density and scalability. But you're only seeing three components here, which is already more complicated than a battery. And there's also the matter of water management. So we make hydrogen by splitting water apart, and we also have to compress that hydrogen. So there's more components than just these three. There's a compressor, there's water treatment, pumps and valves, and ends up having quite a low round trip efficiency and a lot of added engineering. So part of my research, I looked at projects that have been pursued to date, kind of the energy landscape, and formulated these two research objectives. So I was to generate a flexible modeling tool for looking at this technology in a microgrid setting, and then use that tool to kind of assess the potential of this storage for Arctic communities. And obviously, popular choice, I integrated my tool within PGM, which is Anthony's software. And this is clearly too small to see what's going on. But just quickly, the code itself is in C++, uses object-oriented programming, and I added a hydrogen energy storage asset next to, or with in the same place as the lithium-ion battery, so you can select it in that open source tool. And I've just published my version with the hydrogen module just added to Anthony's existing code on GitHub, so you can go try it out. Still working on documentation and making it all nice and tidy like Anthony's, but it'll get there. But yeah, what I have going on is a class for the hydrogen energy storage module, and then electrolyzer and fuel cell subclasses to model some more specific operations of those components. And I've also added, so there's quite a lot more methods because I'm modeling a three-part system. And I've also added a thermal model to kind of provide some insight to modelers about the waste heat and the thermal state of the hydrogen system components and potential for harnessing waste heat or sharing heat between storage assets. So yeah, happy to answer questions about that. But after I built this code, I then wanted to test it and take a look at it with real microgrid settings. So I did case studies for these three communities, but today I'm going to focus on my results, which are in my thesis, which look at Syneriac. And yeah, that's how the technology works, but now I'll tell you guys what I found out. So Syneriac is a small hamlet about serving under 1,000 people live there, and they have renewable energy goals, and High Latitude was looking at supporting them on a system for 1 megawatt of wind, 500 kilowatts of solar, and a 900 kilowatt hour battery. And then also did a kind of feasibility study for the potential of adding a small scale hydrogen system to look at how they could further their captivation of those renewable assets they were already planning. So it's a 200 kilowatt electrolyzer, a 200 kilogram hydrogen tank, and a 100 kilowatt fuel cell. So I used their community energy data. I was very lucky to have access to that and took this pilot system and ran some tests. And I'll just show a few things. Oops. This is some outputs from my thermal model. So this one here is the environmental temperature data from Syneriac, so pretty cold. And then it shows my predicted battery storage housing and hydrogen storage housing temperatures. And then I also ran this in a warm climate, just to observe the differences of, we're working in the Arctic. And just my high-level findings here were that there are perceived benefits from a thermal management perspective on hydrogen in the Arctic versus in a warm climate. Both assets are sitting more frequently on their top temperature bound, so they're running pretty hot. They need to be cooled down. In a hot place, that would be a large load, but in the Arctic, that is could potentially, with added engineering, be used for to heat a nearby building or heat some water up. So that was something I observed, and then also did observe quite a lot of heat sharing. So the battery didn't need to be heated as much because the hydrogen assets, whenever they're running, put off a lot of heat. So that means, I guess to go back, fuel cells and electrolyzers are not super efficient, and their heat is lost to thermal energy. So that's what's happening here. Yeah, and then, they're running pretty frequently with this small scale pilot design. And because they're running quite frequently, I found that they had a thermal resiliency, which is, I'm saying, if they were running and then they stopped, they wouldn't need to be heated until about 40 hours later. So 40 hours of energy autonomy to say, which is great because, as we know, there are power outages in microgrid communities. I also took a look at, I built a degradation model for the fuel cell and electrolyzers, and that was kind of the best I could do without access to real microgrid data for these two technologies. But just to show here that for the pilot scale electrolyzer and fuel cell, there was, for the electrolyzers, about 3.2% loss of state of health over a year, and then 1.7 for the fuel cells. And I simulated then again for a larger system. So the 99% renewable energy penetration system is like a 1,000 kilowatt electrolyzer, so a lot bigger. And it was interesting to see that for these two systems, they observed similar degradation on an annual basis for the electrolyzers and then comparing fuel cells. But we can talk more about that. And then the second research objective is, what is the potential that my model is predicting for this technology in UVic? And I looked at that question of, when does it start to make sense to consider hydrogen? If I open the search space, how can it help UVic get farther potential or other communities? And I ran some models I actually ran it from 50 to 100, but where I, with an optimization engine, asked the model to predict the least cost system for getting to these various renewable energy penetration scenarios if it had only battery storage in the search space versus if it had batteries and hydrogen. And what I found was that around 65%, really hard to tell, but it starts to build hydrogen. It's beneficial to have long duration storage there. And then that cost that becomes a little bit more of a difference, around 80%, and you'll notice that then the gap kind of widens from there. And I also performed a brief cost sensitivity analysis where I doubled the cost of the hydrogen system components, because this is a novel technology. We don't know how much the installed cost would actually be. So just to show that for those upper levels, the optimizer was still building hydrogen, even if it was very expensive, twice as expensive as my already hopefully conservative estimates were. And the reason for that is essentially, when you have access to long duration storage, the model doesn't have to overbuild its renewable assets as much. So as we know, in these settings, you usually oversize your wind and solar so that even on a cloudy day or even on a day when the sun's not out as much, you still are generating some energy to store to get you through the next deficit. And by adding hydrogen to the system, I saw that we really didn't have to oversize our wind and solar as much, which was a huge cost saving. And that this is kind of shown in this graph. And then at these high-level renewable energy penetration levels, our cost contributions are really so much of the cost in UVic anyway. It has a great wind resource. So for 95% renewable energy penetration system with hydrogen, the wind and solar are making up almost 70% of that cost. So if you're able to have, basically more storage and reduce your renewable asset investment, then more expensive storage is not outweighed by that. And I guess I'll go back here and just say that to give this a little bit more context, that FAR system with 99% renewable energy, with the battery-only technology, like only batteries are the only storage technology available, you need 4 megawatts of wind to get up there, which is so much for a small community, versus if you have access to hydrogen, the model is saying that you only need 2 megawatts of wind. So you're saving quite a lot of money by having a long duration storage. And then I'm going to go back to this a lot and talk about the elephant in the room, which is that exponential spike at 100%. So I wasn't super surprised by that, but I had to take a look at the time series data to understand why all of a sudden at 100%, remove the diesel generators from the model completely. It was reverting back to building a huge battery. So it no longer wanted to build hydrogen, which was interesting. And experimented a little bit. Basically, that was a function of 2 things. My microgrid control algorithm that I was using, which was just a simple rules-based one, which makes sense simply is let's always deplete the battery first and use it for short duration storage, and then deplete our hydrogen asset and otherwise reserve it for longer deficits. Basically, what was happening is that for that final 1% of energy, it was running into scenarios where there was a very small deficit and the battery is depleted, and that deficit was below the minimum load ratio that my fuel cell was allowed to run at, because I had programmed as many as I could operational constraints to try to simulate these real technologies. So then I run into these times when the model had such a very small deficit that was below the fuel cell's minimum capacity, and so it tipped back to building a very big battery so that it always had that very flexible battery. So, and then, I removed the minimum load ratio constraint from the fuel cell and saw that I no longer had that exponential. And we could get to 100% with hydrogen. So, interesting finding there, just kind of showed me that the model is saying that it is possible to get to 100% without a huge exponential spike with hydrogen and batteries if you engineer smart dispatch protocols to manage the storage assets and maybe some predictive algorithms, or we install modular fuel cells, or we get more flexible fuel cell dispatch. And then more excitingly, I actually got to go to ScenariaC for part of my research, which was great. I went up with Martha and our colleagues Stefan and LJ from the community, and that was really cool. I'm from the Yukon, but Nunavut is a whole different area of the North. It was a really great experience. I got to learn what it's actually like, which, being someone who's programming a model on my computer, is so invaluable. What it's actually like is it's freezing. It was minus 57 one day. You can't take your hands out of your pocket, but I did to take some photos. So they worry about energy all the time. They have 2 energy operators that were very hard to track down. They were busy, and they full-time job is to keep their diesel generators running. That's the full power system. And heat is diesel delivered by truck, water is delivered by diesel truck, very diesel intensive, and they have a kind of deteriorating electrical grid that needs upgrade as well. So lots of learnings, and they've never heard of hydrogen in the context of hydrogen energy storage when we went to the communities, or most of the people we spoke to. So that just led me to try to incorporate more into my model, or just to consider, I'm saying, great, hydrogen, the model says we can do it, let's do it. But that's not actually how these things work. An optimization algorithm can't tell you what's practical. So I just tried to. It's a really great report by Dunsky on hydrogen for remote communities. You should check it out. They also have a bunch of case studies that they did, but they outlined these 6 kind of enabling conditions, and these probably apply to any technology, especially novel ones. But I tried to incorporate some of those into my model, and I'll just focus on resource availability. My model predicts the water demand, and it's actually quite low for ScenariaC, which is great for even a large system. But then inevitably you can't consider everything. So just knowing when you're modeling a new technology, what's unmodeled. And so for resource availability, great, they have enough water. Where's the site? How is it actually going to be delivered there? What's the water filtration process? Also, these systems need nitrogen for purging, so for operation and maintenance, it's not really clear how much, when. So I don't model that. That's a really important thing. Yeah, so in summary, just really aware that successful hydrogen projects would require comprehensive planning past just modeling for, I think, at the earliest stage possible, so at that feasibility or pre-feasibility phase. My main conclusions, just to go over them quickly, is hydrogen shows benefits in cold climates compared to warm climates from a thermal management perspective. Degradation of different system sizes from my simple degradation model was similar on an annual basis and aligned with kind of what manufacturer spreadsheet or spec sheets are saying. Seasonal storage, which I looked at a little bit, and come talk to me if you want to. Just really where we have solar only demanded a large electrolyzer and storage tank sizes that were unrealistic. And Scenaric has a strong wind resource, but I think I think my results say that winter generation is necessary. And then green hydrogen storage can maybe support these communities in the future if they're appropriately engineered with that smart dispatch, or we look at fuel cell flexibility. And then this would kind of be my guide is promise of hydrogen in my work may encourage communities to explore this technology in the future if they have those high renewable energy penetration goals. Otherwise, batteries are great for supporting these Arctic systems to a certain point, and then strong winter generation and access to those enabling conditions or thorough research into each one. Thank you for listening. Great. I'll pass it off to Oasis and then we can talk about all these different solutions in more depth after.